Good morning, and welcome to the 5th edition of London Encounter. This year, as you all know, I think, our theme is the human being, a paradox of freedom. So it's a fairly weighty subject, and I think what we were trying to explore or unpack is, what is freedom? Is it the kind of idea of freedom that we generally take for granted, the idea that freedom is about doing what we want to do, about maximizing our room for maneuver in life? Or perhaps is freedom something a little different? So that's what we want to explore on this day. We'll have a meeting on this subject, particularly looking at freedom in the work environment this afternoon. We have two exhibitions that talk to this. One about David Jones, the poet and painter who served in World War I, which ended 100 years ago. And we have another exhibition about Metropolitan Anthony Bloom, who emigrated to the UK and was here after World War II. Very important religious figure. And we'll be hearing more about him this morning. So thank you for being here. All I will want to do now, I think, is to very briefly introduce a man who needs no introduction, Rowan Williams, our patron, who, as you all know, is the Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge, and former Archbishop of Canterbury. Rowan, thank you very much again for being with us. And Rowan has kindly agreed to moderate this morning's meeting. So I will get away from the stage and leave Rowan to kindly introduce our guest this morning. I will do that after the meeting, yeah. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's, as always, a great pleasure and a great privilege to be part of this Encounter meeting. And I'm very glad to see so many people and very glad to have such a very distinguished panel alongside me. Some of you will know the science fiction stories of Ursula Le Guin, the Earthsea stories. And some of you may remember that in one of them, one of the characters says that the more you grow and become wise, the more you do what you have to do. And that's perhaps the paradox of freedom we're addressing today. In a certain spiritual context, freedom is not a supreme consumer liberty for the self to take down from the shelf whatever it wants. It's the freedom to find food, to be nourished, to grow as you're meant to. The freedom to be who you are and what you are. Sometimes we think of restrictions on freedom in terms of restrictions on choice, absolute, abstract choice. But think for a moment of what it is to stop somebody finding the food they need to grow. That's the deepest offence, the deepest limitation of freedom. And in the animal world, if an animal is prevented from finding food, it will die. It will not have that basic freedom to be itself, to act out its nature, to live and to grow. And that's, I suppose, the paradox we're looking at today. For religious people, certainly, for Christians above all, to grow in freedom is to grow in the ability to do what we have to do, to grow in the freedom to be human. And that means, in the Christian framework, the freedom to be in relation with God and to be in loving, grateful interdependence with one another. That's our freedom. And it's got not a lot to do with the model of freedom we sometimes take for granted, what I call the consumer model. It sounds strange at first sight because we like to think that our freedom must be to have as much choice as possible. But what if the highest or the deepest kind of freedom were just that? To know where we can find nourishment, to have the freedom to feed, to grow, to relate. All our speakers will be addressing this subject from different points of view. And the two people whose lives are celebrated in the exhibitions today are, of course, very singular, very powerful illustrations, embodiments, rather, of the freedom I've been talking about. David Jones, both as artist and poet, is somebody struggling all the time in his visual art and in his poetry to find a way of being in touch with and nourished by the whole realm of nature and grace as it comes to him. His outward life was modest to the point of deprivation at some points. He lived for most of his life with agonizing states of depression and anxiety. He very consciously denied himself the comforts of family life. And within that apparently narrow strand, the world opened out more and more in his words and in his images. Metropolitan Anthony, for whom I constantly give thanks, a great beacon of inspiration to me over many, many years, was somebody who, again, came from a background of displacement, privation, unfreedom, an exile in a foreign country, twice over, an exile from Russia in France, an exile again in Britain. He learned the languages of the places of his exile so as to be eloquently and fully the person God meant him to be. And he was a channel of grace and liberation for so many because of that. With those lives and the images of those lives in front of us, in our minds and hearts, we're embarking on this discussion today of true freedom, where we find it, how we live it, that paradox of growing up in a liberty so deep, so extraordinary, that we end up doing what we have to do. We end up with that supreme, creative, imaginative, outrageous liberty of just being who we are and what we are as human beings. And I hope and pray that our discussion today will enrich our own vision of what that freedom might be for each one of us. So, without more ado, I'll introduce our speakers. Our first speaker this morning is George Corbett from the University of St Andrews, where he is in the Divinity Department. His professional expertise is wide-ranging but centres on the work of Dante. And we look forward very deeply to hearing, George, what you have to say to us. Please welcome, George.
Thank you, Rowan, very much. The paradox of Christian freedom is memorably expressed by poets such as Dante. To a higher law, you free are subject, or in English, Milton, freely we serve. Is then Christian freedom a contradiction in terms? At best, a mystery or a paradox. At worst, the denial of the spirit of the liberal age, which values self-liberation, liberal-mindedness, free-spiritedness, free thinking, free action above all else. That Christianity is somehow opposed to human freedom is a common perception, I think, among Christians and non-Christians alike. But by the end of my brief reflections, I hope you may be persuaded that it is a common misconception. First, I'm going to suggest that while Christian freedom is necessarily related to the rightness, goodness, or not of what is chosen, without such an orientation to the truth, freedom degenerates into mere license, the license to do whatever I please, as embodied in that slogan, forbidden to forbid. Secondly, though, I'm going to take on a tendency to characterize Christian freedom, nonetheless, as just or as simply obedience to God's law. The expansive world of Christian freedom need not be limited, I think, to the relatively provincial moral choices between a good and an evil. The predominant exercise of our human freedom and the secret of our individuality, of our own individual uniqueness, is instead in our choosing between a huge array of different but equally wonderful good actions. And finally, I'm going to suggest that we might in fact understand Christian freedom as the greatest fulfillment of human freedom through meditating a little on human art and on the lives of the saints. So, first of all, the relationship between freedom and the law. It's perhaps unsurprising that Christians, especially in their engagement with wider culture and society, might be tempted to steer clear of discussion of the moral law altogether. Much better to focus on our shared desires for meaning, for fulfillment, for truth, for happiness, for beauty, and open up Christianity in a crowded spiritual marketplace as the way to get there. Even in academia, we see the same tendency. Thus, for example, the great Christian theologian St. Thomas Aquinas is often presented today as a virtue ethicist, and his goal-directed teleological approach to ethics is contrasted with a law, duty-based, so-called deontological approach associated with Enlightenment philosophers such as Kant. But in talking about Christian freedom, you just can't get away, I don't think, from talking about truth and the law. Thus, for example, while St. Thomas Aquinas starts his famous treatise on man with happiness, man's end, he ends the treatise with the discussion on law and grace. There is little point knowing about our end, after all, if we don't know how to get there. Herein, arguably, lies the drama, then, of Christian freedom. Our will may be compared to our feet. Assuming we are not enslaved, our feet are not tied down, we are free to walk. But then what? Where do we go? Where are we headed? And how do we get there? Law is the light that orientates our freedom, enabling us to discern what is truly good and avoid what appears to us as a good but will actually lead to misery. Just as we cannot walk unaided in the dark, so we cannot exercise our free will without the law. It really is the truth of the law, in other words, that lights up, that sets free our freedom, that enables us to walk freely on life's journey. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. There is a sense, then, that Christian freedom is inextricably linked to a free obedience to God, a free obedience to the truth. However, we need not think that for Christians, freedom is just the freedom to sin or not to sin. Law may be the light, but it is still for us to chart our own path to happiness. So now it's the second part, talking about the expansiveness of Christian freedom. Sometimes I think we can fall into the trap of thinking that moral acts are only those acts that involve a choice between a good and an evil. However, all human acts, as freely willed, are moral, and most of those acts do not involve a choice between right and wrong. There is, in other words, a spaciousness to human freedom. Crucially, then, we are free to choose different goods or different courses of action without one necessarily being right, good, and another one being necessarily bad or sinful. There are indeed as many different ways that we can be good, follow the moral law, serve the common good, attain eternal life even, as there are people. Billions of paths, in other words, to God, none of which are the same. The moral law, therefore, does not preclude in any way individuality. Rather, it opens up our freedom to act. Which goods and which courses of action we choose will depend not on an objective difference in their respective value, but rather on our own uniqueness as human persons. And this, I think, is the great joy of Christian freedom. Even in trivial things, we can relish choosing an apple rather than a pear, or a pink lady apple rather than a Granny Smith apple, as an exercise of our human freedom. In more profound ways, we can trust our deepest desires and be attentive to our particular talents and our particular history and context. And it's depending on all of these that we will choose our own path. When we look at the lives of the saints, moreover, we are struck by how extraordinarily different they are. Think only of the difference between Saint Teresa of Avila, a cloistered contemplative mystic, and Saint Teresa of Calcutta, Mother Teresa, living amongst the poorest of the poor. Totally different. But these saints all lived in the light of God's law, and yet all chose incredibly different paths to heaven. Indeed, one might argue that, in following God's law, they were freed to pursue their individual genius, their individual paths to holiness. That this is St. Paul's understanding of the liberty of the children of God. Oh, lovely. This poster image for the London encounter of a child, a toddler, holding the finger of an adult, perhaps embodies this relationship. The Christian is free to roam because he or she is held by God's hand, guided by God's law. Finally, a note on artistic freedom. For there seems to me a parallel between an exaltation of human freedom as a goal in itself in contemporary society and the exaltation of freedom in creative practice. The idea, that is, of the free-spirited artist, free of tradition, unshackled of commitment. Today, as has been mentioned, there is an exhibition featuring the work of David Jones. Jones, by contrast, sees in religion and in the etymology of religio a binding, ligare, that makes possible authentic freedom. He writes, "The same root is in ligament, a binding which supports an organ and assures that organ its freedom of use as part of a body. The binding makes possible freedom. Cut the ligament and there is atrophy, corpse rather than corpus." That's from his essay, Art and Sacrament. In the Institute for Theology, Imagination and the Arts, based in the University of St. Andrew's Divinity School, I've worked recently with the contemporary composer Sir James Macmillan and poet Michael Simmons Roberts, both of whom cite this passage from David Jones and see it as important for understanding the nature of musical and poetic composition. For James Macmillan, even the great modernist composers of the last 100 years, such as Stravinsky, Schoenberg, Poulenc, Messiaen, Schnittke and Avopert, were in different ways profoundly religious men and women. For the poet Michael Simmons Roberts, the great 20th century innovators in poetry, such as T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden and David Jones himself, were profoundly rooted in religious traditions. As Pope Benedict XVI wrote at the very close of the 20th century in the year 2000, artists are weary of the empty freedom from which they have emerged. Humble submission to what goes before us releases authentic freedom and leads us to the true summit of our vocation as human beings. With earlier composers such as Vivaldi, Bach or Mozart, moreover, one could perhaps go further still. Their musical language can become a metaphor for Christian freedom. Mozart's music is bound by certain rules of harmony and structure, but how free, how beautiful is his music, what endless variety, how extraordinary, how unique, how new is each piece. And so also I think for us, as we see from the lives of the saints, the truths of God's law are like the ligaments of a body that enable a person to function properly, to flourish, to be fully who he or she is. Have we started to move beyond then the paradox of Christian freedom? A paradox may be defined as a self-contradictory or even absurd statement. In reflecting on God's law as the ligament of a body, as the harmonic language of a Baroque partita or classical symphony, it seems to me that we have. Christian freedom, freely we serve, makes sense. It is coherent, precisely because, as David Jones says, it is the binding that makes possible the freedom. Thank you.
George, thank you for a wonderful framing exercise there in putting into perspective what we're going to apply now in various more immediate contexts to think about freedom in practice, in exercise. And I'm going to turn next to our second guest speaker, Professor Aleksandr Filonenko, who is Professor of Cultural Theory, Philosophy and Theology at Kharkiv National University. We're very honored that he should take the time to come a long distance and speak to us, and delighted to listen to what he has to say to us.
Thank you very much. Good morning. First of all, I must ask you excuse me my wonderful primitive English. It's first time when I will must read it. I never read anything, but it's first time when I must do it. And I will present my paper which is devoted to relation between freedom and dignity of man, and this is reflections on based on experience of Russian immigrants of 20th century. First point is about relation between freedom and dignity, and reflections on this theme, which are based on the experience of the Orthodox tradition, are determined by the post-atheist situation after almost century of church persecutions in the Soviet Union, as well as by experiments in dehumanization in Auschwitz and Gulag. Modern theology establishes itself in the very heart of an anthropological catastrophe caused by the totalitarian practices of 20th century. Therefore, I'd like to start with a very provocative argument about the human being, one of which we find in the sermon which Metropolitan Anthony gave at the University of Oxford in 1967. A bishop of Russian Orthodox Church. He had lived through First World War, which caused the fall of 3 Christian empires. He was a representative of Russian emigres whose history started with the fall of monarchy in the revolution of 1917, 3 years of civil war, and finally the loss of Russia. After living as monk and a doctor during Second World War, Anthony Bloom founded the Russian Orthodox Diocese in post-war Britain. Speaking from chair of University Church, he opened his sermon on the greatness of man with these words: "Two notions have come to the fore since the war, perhaps more than in the years that preceded it. The notion of the greatness of man, of his significance both for us, man, and for God, and the notion of human solidarity. The experience of tragic liberation from his homeland, his traditions, status, property, enabled him to see the connection between freedom, dignity, and solidarity. Anthony relates the freedom and dignity of man to man greatness, which is then a man can be an unworthy son, quotation, he can be a repentant son, he can come back to the father's house, but only as his son. Unworthy through he be as a son, he can never become a worthy hireling. And this is the way in which God looks at man in terms of the sonship offered us in the incarnation of the Lord Jesus Christ, already implicit in the act of creation and our calling to become partakers of the divine nature. This is our vocation, this is what we are called to, and nothing less than this is acceptable to the Lord. The theme of solidarity is related to this understanding of the vocation of a free man. Quotation, our solidarity must be with Christ first, and in him with all men to the very limit, to the full measure of life and death. Only then, if we accept this, can we, each of us and the congregation of all the faithful, the people of God, grow into what Christ and the apostles were, a group of people whose vision was greater than the world's vision, whose scope was greater than the world's scope, so that from the very beginning the church could contain all in itself, could partake in all the conditions of man's existence, and therefore lead mankind to salvation. Metropolitan Anthony developed such an impressive idea of human dignity that it's able to give a response to the catastrophes of 20th century through his theological reflection about freedom as a gift, a reflection which derived from the Christian life of the Russian emigres. Next point is about freedom as gift and radical Christocentrism. The Christian value of the experience of the Russian emigres consists in the understanding of exile as God's calling for the new life in Christ, developed by its best theologians. Modern Europe now faces serious difficulties due to inward immigration that can be numbered in millions. Then, after the First World War, more than 3 million citizens of the former Russian Empire found themselves in a devastated Europe. Metropolitan Anthony expressed this in a very short phrase: the Lord took us like seeds and scattered us all around the world. Such a perspective of his own catastrophe of exile was possible through the acknowledgement of freedom revealed as a God's gift. Mother Maria Skoptsova, or the writer's new martyr Saint Maria of Paris, canonized in 2004, a devotee of the Christian movement and the great thinker of the interwar period, described this experience of freedom as, quotation, some absolute falling out of the pattern, a final liberation from any external responsibility, and extremely painful and at the same time blissful experience beyond the control of power, public opinion, traditions, customs, and the history of our own country. But such freedom obliges, freedom requires sacrificing oneself, freedom determines honesty and austerity towards oneself and one's way. The truth of this freedom drives one away from calmness and issues this call, quotation, go to the church, as there you will feel the true anxiety about your sins, about your perdition, about the sins and perdition of the world. There you will feel hunger for the truth of Christ, then you can never satisfy. There from tepid warmth you will become aflame, from calm anxious, from people knowing the wisdom of this age you will become fools in Christ. For emigres younger than Mother Maria, those like Metropolitan Anthony, laws of everything meant also the laws of the church tradition. The call of freedom at the edge of the world demanded a response from every person, but this response could be a human decision. Such was encounter with Christ himself. Metropolitan Anthony describes the spiritual experience of his generation in such words. We found ourselves without a homeland, separated from everything we loved, from our closest and most beloved. We became foreigners in foreign land, unwanted and out of place. There was nothing but misery. But then we realized that we have God, whom we must not be ashamed of, and who is not ashamed of us. After that, we realized that he can come with us to the very abyss of our grief. He had experienced everything up to the very edge of deprivation, and he went much further than the edge. And in the abyss of our fallen, we found Christ, saving, comforting, and calling us to live. The experience of Christians as emigres was fulfilled in the story of the deepest human need and perplexity in the face of radical freedom, which became, by virtue of the encounter with Christ at the edges of life, such a lack and weakness that transformed life into a way of witnessing flaming sacrificial love. This recognition of freedom as gift in the Orthodox Church gave rise to the so-called Russian student Christian movement, which was also associated with the ministry of one of the greatest Orthodox thinkers of 20th century, Father Sergei Bulgakov. In 1923, the first Russian student conference took place in Przerov, a small town in Czechoslovakia, where Father Sergei suggested three fundamental characteristics of the movement. First, responsibility for the destiny of the Church in Russia and abroad. Second, recognition of new Eucharistic epoch. Third, affirmation of the ecumenical nature of Eastern Orthodoxy and therefore aspiration for restored communion with Western Christians. The purpose of the movement was the churching of life, and as in its center, the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And for Bulgakov, the movement became a way for foster awareness that, quotation, the Church of Christ is not an institution, but a new life with Christ and in Christ, driven by the Holy Spirit. One of the fruits of this movement was the establishment of Anglican Orthodox Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius in Britain, and of the chair of Orthodox Theology in Oxford. Understanding freedom as God's gift rather than the tragedy of expulsion opened us up to the theme of the new Eucharistic era, an era which, in Mother Maria Skoptsova words, is defined by conforming one's life to Christ, from which follows understanding Christianity as an everlasting liturgy celebrated outside the church building. Later, in 1939, in his article, The Second Gospel Commandment, Mother Maria would describe the tendency to, quotation, preach the deepening in oneself, withdrawal from life, and the standing of an individual soul before God's as the main spiritual temptation during the time of historical tragedies. She tried to explain instead that the most personal, the most precious thing an Orthodox person has is penetrated by the feeling of community with everything, the feeling of that Catholic conciliar beginning which is inherent to the Orthodox Church. Mother Maria would die a martyr's death at Ravensbrück concentration camp on the 31st of March in 1945. The Russian student Christian movement, of which Mother Maria was one of the founders, bears the fruits of her teaching up to today, perhaps the most relevant thing to highlight from this experience is that the movement of church starts from the free following of Christ's traces in the midst of tragic circumstances, when the ability to hear Christ calling and assisting in silence in his presence become crucial. And Mother Maria is witness to this connection between freedom and Christocentrism. Last point is relation between freedom and relation with the other. Accepting freedom as God's gift implies accepting also the other's freedom as gift. The theology of encounter developed by Metropolitan Anthony started from recognizing the other in his freedom, a freedom which he will describe as follows. Quotation, we have to recognize the existence of the other man, we have to enter in a relationship with the other, which no doubt will tear us apart, as it will ask us to overcome ourselves, to renounce ourselves, to die in order to allow the other to open up with all his needs, with his right to live, to independence, and to freedom outside us. His teaching of understanding of others' freedom as God's gift also leans to his ecumenical position. In 1970, during his talk in Chartres Cathedral, in front of many representatives of different Christian traditions, he said, "Our Christian communities divided many centuries ago, and in the long run we turned our backs on each other and distanced ourselves even more. We then stopped, and then we turned ourselves again to see that other, who once was our brother and later became a stranger, and oftentimes an enemy. And we were too far away to distinguish the other's features. We could no longer see the image of God in that one from whom we separated and who left us. And then a new journey started, a long journey which once more brought us closer. Today we are close enough to be able to look at each other in the eyes, penetrate to the very depth of each other's hearts and souls, and judge each other's actions and see that they are driven by a freedom longing for God. But how hard it's to be just. The first act of justice is to let the other person be who he is, not a mere copy of who we are. The other is created by God. He is not made in our image. He is turned toward God, not toward us. He has to become himself and not to adapt to our requirements. Later, in 1990, he used these words to express his understanding of God's gift in living relationship and freedom. Quotation, building the city of God means giving ourselves to God, discarding both our strengths and our weakness, and allowing God's grace to act freely in and through us. This is missionary work, but not proselytism, not an attempt to make others as we are, but to share with them the transfiguring joy of knowing God and of communion with Him. So that they may become themselves as unlike us as they are, unique in the eyes of God. It's not in uniformity that we can be one, but in oneness that is attainable only through uniqueness, like musical notes capable of forming one perfect accord because they are themselves without confusion but also without competition. Yet another important moment of encountering another's freedom was a moment of meeting with atheists. The focus of these meetings for him was about human dignity and freedom. Once, while he was on steps of a Moscow hotel called Ukraine, he was approached by a Soviet officer who asked him, "Well, you believe in God, and what does God believe in?" And Metropolitan Anthony answered, "God believes in man." End quotation. This is the first step in Christian life, together with God, to believe in man, starting from oneself. Christ tells us that we must love our neighbor as we love ourselves, and this is not a random thing. To love means to be ready to do everything so that our beloved rejoices in her life, grows to her full measure, and be worthy of her humanity. This is why the first thing that Christ teaches us as his disciples is to believe in man, expect the best from him, and love him, even at the cost of our own life. Both an atheist and Christian alike seek for human dignity, but find it in dependent images of humanity. A Christian encounter with another freedom means our readiness as Christian, quotation, to state that a man is more than that which an atheist imagines a man to be. Christianity experiences humanity uniquely, which my freedom blossoms in an encounter with Christ. Christianity sees man neither as a slave to tradition, nor as an orphaned individual. Living before Christ brings one to experience life as a son and a free man. When we consider modern societies in Europe and in post-Soviet countries, from the point of view of human freedom and dignity, we have to admit that the societies are in crisis, though they are reached it by very different paths. Both modern Europe and post-Soviet Ukraine discovered their identities by two great farewells: a farewell to Nazism after the Second World War and a farewell to communism after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The last 30 years of freedom showed that farewells are not enough to answer the question, who are we? A positive beginning is required, and Russian emigres of 20th century showed us by their path and witness that a positive beginning is only possible when we understand freedom as a divine gift. This understanding opens a Christian view of human dignity, a view which is unheard of since the anthropological catastrophe of 20th century. All of us, not just in Ukraine, needs a revolution of human dignity, revolution which Pope Francis called a revolution of tenderness after an age of cruelty. A tragic experience of dehumanization leads us to rediscover tenderness as a new name for freedom, a freedom which blossoms when we encounter Christ and the freedom of others. Thank you very much.
It was a very special delight to hear two great figures celebrated so eloquently in that talk, Mother Maria Skoptsova and Metropolitan Anthony Bloom. Both of them, uprooted and deprived, eventually embodied for so many people the richness of God's gifts, the opening of a door into new life, and the freedom of that stripping, that detachment, which exile involved, leads us on very naturally to our third presentation. Heather Richardson is the CEO of St. Christopher's Hospice in London. And as many of you will know, this was the institution which, under the visionary leadership of Cicely Saunders, pioneered palliative care in this country, to such an extent that now it's almost impossible to think of how things were before palliative care was so professionalized as it has been in the last few decades. We now have a quite different attitude to the end of life, regarding this not simply as privation but as opportunity. St. Christopher's has had a unique role in that, and we're very privileged to have Heather with us to tell us a bit about how that works.
Thank you so much. So I've been asked to speak today about freedom at the end of life. And whilst my talk doesn't explicitly focus on the spiritual dimension of this, our moderator and other speakers are much better placed to do that than I. The importance of attending to the spirit and one's relationship with God at the end of life is an implicit vital component. It's one of the foundations about everything else that I'm going to talk about today. So, the first question I'm going to answer is whether freedom at the end of life is really even possible. You might be thinking that this notion is extraordinary at best or crazy at worst. And of course, at some levels, you're right. Freedom is often associated with having options open to you, of having choice, control, and autonomy in what you pursue and how. Conversely, the experience of dying is often associated with reducing horizons, fewer possibilities, new constraints as someone's illness progresses, their weakness increases, and the time left to try anything new or different becomes increasingly limited. Even so, I'm going to argue in the course of the next 15 or so minutes that there are ways in which people can find a sense of freedom, even at such a challenging time in their life. And I'm going to argue also towards the end of my talk that this opportunity is enhanced if we attend to the end of our lives while we're still busy living them. More of that later. So let's start by thinking about what offers people the experience of freedom at the end of their lives. Over the course of the last 30 years or so, I've had the privilege of being involved in the lives of many people who are coming to the end of theirs. That doesn't mean I've cracked the mystery of death. Far from it. I remain as in awe of death today as I did in 1984 when I saw my first patient die as a nurse. I remember then realising that I could not discern the moment that he ceased to be alive in this world, despite my kneeling close to him, only knowing some minutes later that he was no longer present in mind or spirit. Some hundreds of deaths later, I know that my identification and understanding of that moment remains opaque at best. It seems to me on reflection that it's an intensely private moment in which the worldly observer cannot be part, however close. That said, I've watched some people die well and some people die quite differently, and the notion of freedom is an important part of that. In my experience, freedom at the end of life comprises a number of key components. First, people need warning that they're going to die. One of the biggest changes that Dame Cicely Saunders, founder of the modern hospice movement, called for in her work to change the way that people died in the 1960s and 1970s was an honest conversation on the part of professionals about someone's deteriorating condition and the likely outcome that they could expect of death. Whilst this is undoubtedly one of the most uncomfortable discussions a health professional ever has with someone in their care, it can be a pivotal moment in someone's life. If someone knows what is happening, then they can reclaim some control in the plan for their remaining life, how and when they spend their time. Even when people find the news very hard to hear, they will often be grateful in the long term, in my experience. Some of the thanks that we receive in the hospice in which I work is around the very honest conversations that we have. I recently picked up a card that had been written to the staff on one of the wards at St Christopher's. It said, "Words cannot express how grateful we are to each and every one of you. Not only were you angels to our mum, but you were so patient and kind to all of us, always there to talk to, even with the most difficult of conversations." Then, people need time to get their head around the situation and to explore what is most important for them to address. One of the real challenges about end of life is that the vast majority of the public don't have multiple experiences of death in their lifetime in which they can become expert. They won't have done the thinking in advance about what's important to them or what they want to prioritise. They will have to weigh up the pros and cons of the various options, understand the relative risks, learn more about the likely trajectory and impact of their illness. People often need answers to these questions repeated again and again, expanded, explained to them, help to get their head around what's likely to happen. It requires huge courage on the part of the person who's dying, those close to them, and the health professionals involved in their care. It is not easy conversation, believe me. When people know what they want to address, they also need permission and help from people around them to enact what's most important to them. At the very least, people need the opportunity to talk about what is in their mind and to explore various options. This may sound easy to you, but in fact it's very difficult. People often don't have a common language about death, dying and loss. They don't know whether people will be open to talking about something so morbid. For some people, there is an anxiety that if you start to talk about death, it'll happen. That's one of the reasons that lots of people put off making a will. Perhaps most concerning is the situation when someone finds the strength and the courage to talk about their impending death, only to be told by the very people they need to speak to, "Oh, don't start all that. I'm sure it's going to be fine." This response, done with the best of intentions, is often far from comforting or emancipatory. It shuts down that much-needed conversation. You might argue that people need mental capacity to be able to create and engage with the freedom that I've been talking about at the end of life. I don't know that to be true. I remember the death of my grandmother, who died in a care home in her early 90s. She'd been diagnosed as having advanced dementia, and it was very difficult to have any real conversation with her, particularly in the last few years of her life. Even so, one of the most regular things that she did say was, "I wish I were dead." Her first son, my father, who visited her daily and was hugely attentive, found this almost unbearable, and he'd often admonish her, "Don't say that. We don't want that. You don't really want that." One weekend, whilst he was in Kenya on a most infrequent work trip, she died quietly in the middle of the night. He was devastated that he wasn't there, but I truly believe she planned it that way. He simply wouldn't let her die, and she knew she couldn't continue as she was. She found her freedom when he was out of the country and enacted her wish when he couldn't persuade her otherwise. So, when people have freedom at the end of life, what does it offer them? In a nutshell, I think it enables people to end their mortal lives well. This will mean a huge variety of things to people, depending on how they've lived their lives, whether they have a faith, what's important to them. What constitutes a good death will vary significantly from person to person. That will be as true in this room as it is in London and our country and our world. The freedom about which we speak this morning is about the intention to enact that death, whatever it is. For some people, there's stuff that must be done before you die that is most important. You would be surprised how many weddings take place in a hospice. People who want to ensure that an important relationship is legitimised even as they're dying is often a call for our help. Baptisms, confirmations, other religious rites take place frequently as well. Sometimes it's much more frivolous. A family trip to a Bond movie in the knowledge that this has always been a highlight historically and the making of memories is important now like never before. A visit to the Shard. A trip somewhere exciting. A vital conversation might be the most pressing issue, passing on a piece of information that will otherwise die with the person. Dying well may also be about being in a certain place. I'll never forget the young Sikh gentleman that we cared for, who, on learning he had an aggressive and incurable cancer, made the immediate decision to return to Amritsar in Punjab in India. He had only recently come to England with his wife and 2 small children to build a life as an engineer in this country. He'd worked hard and at great personal sacrifice to establish them as a family in London. Now, on learning the news of his illness, there was only one place he wanted to be. Needless to say, it was a huge challenge. The airlines were reluctant to take him. He needed lots of medication to be pain-free. We're fearful he might die en route. He was prepared to take all the risks, and so he and his wife and the 2 children returned to India. We heard later from his wife that he died in the Golden Temple, just as he wished. His freedom took him home, geographically and spiritually. For some people, it may not be so much a place as relationships that form the focus of aspirations about how to die well. Some of the best deaths I've witnessed have been those that exist within a net of strong relationships. My friend Donal, whose father died last year, spoke of an extraordinarily peaceful and enriching time immediately prior to his death, in which his dad remained at the heart of his family throughout his short illness, simply slipping away after supper one night. Their priority as a close family of 8 children was to be present and with their mum and dad at this time. For everyone, it was as they wanted it to be. Sometimes relationships need to be healed. I picked up another card on the ward last week that told just such a story. The card read, "To the whole team, thank you so much for the constant care, love and support you gave to my brother. As you know, we had lost touch for 16 years. It was so heartwarming for me to know that he had you all caring for him and me in such a dignified way. He had so much peace towards the end, as did I." Freedom to die well is also about dying as you have lived. People don't change on learning that they have a terminal illness. People who've lived tidy and orderly lives often die that way too. People who live chaotically die like that as well. It's easy for professionals like me to want to tidy up those lives, literally and metaphorically. I've seen people die in extraordinarily messily homes. My idea of hell, but a place in which they feel really comfortable. I've known people who want to die alone, often because they've lived their whole life like that, even when they know that might be hard in reality. Professionals will often balk at that idea. I spoke earlier of the importance of freedom to attend to anything outstanding. Dame Cicely Saunders always spoke of the value of saying thank you. I would agree. Being able to say thank you before you die is an important part of being free and finding freedom. Most of us are hugely indebted to lots of people in the course of our lives, and for some folks, being able to acknowledge that can be part of the course of dying well. I recall a man who died in a hospice I worked many years ago. He was elderly, nothing apparently extraordinary about him, and yet he received visitors in numbers I'd never seen before. I was concerned. He looked tired and he was unwell, and eventually I spoke to him about it. "Oh yes," he said, "there are lots of them. They're the children I've fostered over the years." He and his wife had fostered something in the region of 80 children in their lifetime, individuals that now wanted to come and acknowledge the gift of love and support that he'd offered them. "But perhaps it's too much for you," I argued. "Surely they'll understand." "What you don't understand," he said to me, "is that I've thanks to offer to them too. I want them to know their value to me, as I know my value to them." Dame Cicely also spoke of the importance of saying sorry. When I was working at a local hospice in East London, I had the privilege of working with a number of Muslim patients, their families and their communities. Very often we would observe visits from large numbers of people to someone who was dying throughout the day and night, and often right up until they died. When I asked about the large numbers, I was told that it was part of the requirement of any Muslim to prepare for their death, to seek forgiveness from anyone for whom you'd done some wrong. It was part of the responsibility of the living and the dying, a part of a lifetime's job to prepare for death. For me personally, it is a hugely attractive aspect of the ritual of preparing for death. If there's one thing I'm most concerned about in dying, it's about failing to have put right those wrongs I've done to people in the course of my life. And knowing that not only have I said how sorry I am, but to have received forgiveness is a real gift, a great freedom. That yearning for redemption is something I see in my work regularly. I worked a number of years ago on an academic project which aimed to improve end-of-life care for people in prison. The project had focused on a prison for sex offenders in northwest England. In that context, many of the inmates look after each other, and particularly when someone is dying. They may do the most of their personal care, get up for them in the night, help them eat, walk, wash them, and so on. When one prisoner described why he chose to care for his fellow inmates in this way at the end of life, he described his efforts to me as kind things done by men with ugly faces. A direct quote from an epilogue by John Masefield. That emerging trust arises from the freedom. The quote it says, "I've seen flowers come from stony places, kind things done by men with ugly faces, the gold cup won by the worst horse at the races, so I trust too." That emerging trust arises from the freedom to make amends, to rewrite some part of one's history, to regain some ground lost somewhere in the past. The third suggestion made by Dame Cicely focused on the need to properly say goodbye as one of the tasks of dying well. She was describing, I think, the importance of acknowledging the finality of relationships on this earth as part of letting go. This is as important to do for those being left behind as it is for those who are dying. In my clinical experience, there are some people who know clearly when they're dying and when they need to do that task. I've cared for people who've asked that their families be called in when I would not have deemed them to be at the last stage of their life. They've been clear. The time is coming and goodbyes must be said. More often than not, they died shortly afterwards. These goodbyes are timely and important. They are part of the freedom at the end of life. One task or job of dying well that Dame Cicely didn't speak of, but which I propose today, relates to legacy. I don't mean financial legacy. I mean knowing that you leave something on this earth that acknowledges your presence, your existence in this world. I was part of an interesting project some 18 months ago based in a homeless community in southeast London. The people we spoke to about the end of life were not fearful in the main of dying. Instead, their fear lay in being forgotten, of being unremembered by anyone following their death. One of the ways they found freedom was to tell their stories and to record them in advance of dying. In that way, they were more confident that their families would know some of the truth of their lives when they died if they wanted, that stories of their life would continue to exist beyond their death, even if they had no kin or community to remember them. So, to begin to conclude, I've suggested that people can experience freedom at the end of life despite the limitations of their disease and the shortened time in which they have to live. I've described the essential components of such freedom, warning that death may happen, time and support to prepare. I've suggested that it's a real gift, a chance to get the end of life on this earth right, to say thank you, sorry and goodbye, to attend to your legacy so that those you leave behind can survive and grow beyond your death. I've made it sound easy, but in reality it is very difficult. The conversations that must happen, efforts required to restore relationships and prepare for the future are not easy, and there are lots of things that stop them happening. People often don't know what to say, and they shy away from the whole issue. They don't know how to resolve broken connections or where to start around financial, emotional and practical legacy. If someone is in pain or distressed, it's hard to look outside that experience. Where there is little support for this process on the part of family and friends, it's lonely and even harder. I finish then with a proposition for us all to consider. Why don't we start enacting the freedom, using its gift to die well in advance of knowing that death is just round the corner? I recently spoke at a large public event taking a thought-provoking look at the acts of care central to our everyday lives, called Handle with Care. What was fascinating was that most of the discussion initiated by the public focused on their anxiety about living into old age and their fears about dying. They were searching for the freedom we have considered today to die well. The challenge will be to incorporate our learning from the lives and deaths of others into our everyday life, whether we start from a position of illness or in health. In essence, it's about being prepared, saying goodbye, seeking forgiveness, saying goodbye, saying thank you, building legacy and sharing stories, confident you will have made a contribution and be remembered if you die tomorrow. The challenge for us today is that our society pushes us to behave quite differently, and the declining interest in religious ritual denies us those opportunities too. Life today is about living the moment, a breadth of relationships in which there is often very little depth, a language which is illiterate around the important things like death, dying, and loss. We must change that at the levels of our individual lives, the way we operate in our communities, and then across our society. Being open to that, as you are today, is the first step. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Heather. That was an extraordinarily moving survey of how our general considerations of freedom can paradoxically come alive in the face of death. We have about half an hour, perhaps a little bit more, for some discussion and conversation. And in the first place, I'd like to invite the panel themselves to exchange any thoughts that they have before opening this up to the wider audience. And one of the first things that comes to mind listening to Heather is that she's given us a very clear example of one context where the words, "the truth will make you free," come into focus, because the denial of death, the denial of our mortality, is surely one of the things that most gets in the way of our freedom, in that it denies what we are. And I'm going to George, if you've got any thoughts on that.
Thanks very much. No, I totally agree. I think, one of the great mysteries, isn't it, of life is death. But we tend to put death away. We tend to want to keep away from death and suffering. You talked about living in the moment as well. We can. Another mystery, I think, of life is love, and there's a tendency to trivialize love rather than to sort of enter into it. And then a third mystery, I think, is the mystery of God. And again, our culture can push God away. But I think death and love in particular are two mysteries that we all have to encounter and engage with. And I think it was very interesting, Heather saying at the end that in her work, this is something that people in our society are having to deal with. They're having to deal with not having a vocabulary to deal with death and suffering. And I thought it's very moving also hearing about the Sikh tradition or the Muslim tradition, where there's this whole way of dealing with something which is just true. Like you said, we are going to die. And I also was very moved by the way you were talking about bringing that into the everyday. And I was thinking from a Christian point of view, it's not something I do, but you kind of think of the liturgy of the Nunc Dimittis, the Lord now letteth thou thy servant depart in peace, which in a kind of Christian liturgy you'll be doing every day, and that sense of being able to say thank you, to say goodbye. There was something else to say thank you, goodbye. And sorry, every day. I mean, that would be a wonderful thing, I think, for us all to do. So, yes, I don't know whether you want to take on from that, but I agree.
Let me just pass the question to Aleksandr, if I may, because one of the things which I heard Aleksandr saying, in effect, was that those who were exiled from Russia were at the same time set free from a system of power and control which stopped people asking certain questions, seeing certain dimensions of the human world. And denial again seems to come into this.
Просто вопрос к вам, потому что я же слышу, как вы сказали, люди, которые были в изгнании, это для них было освобождение от системы власти, контроля, который прекратил, чтобы люди задавали какие-то важные вопросы, сказали какие-то важные вещи. То есть можете об этом говорить?
Да. Переведите.
Вы говорите?
Нет, вы переводите.
Да, вам микрофон, а мне микрофон. I'll translate. He will answer in Russian, and I'll translate.
Russian. Excuse me. Действительно, то, что поражает нас сегодня в поколении наших отцов и таких фигур, как митрополит Антоний, это то, что они очень ясно приняли катастрофу как подарок.
That which we find amazing nowadays in the generation of our fathers and people like Metropolitan Anthony is that they could see a catastrophe as a gift.
И об этом всегда трудно говорить, но владыка Антоний очень часто повторял, что мы потеряли Христа в великих соборах и встретили его в гараже и подвале.
And this is very difficult to talk about, but Metropolitan Anthony always said, we lost Christ in the great cathedrals and we found him in the garages and basements.
И это действительно в каком-то смысле и наша ситуация сегодня.
And this is in some sense also our situation today.
Когда мы должны заново найти эту нищету, в которой Христос нас принимает.
Because we need to find again that poverty in which Christ accepts us.
И вот я совершенно потрясен как составом нашей сегодняшней встречи.
And I am amazed by the makeup of our meeting today, of the people here.
Нужно сказать, что владыка Антоний был одним из первых, кто был как врач и священник, преподавателем просто на курсах по паллиативной медицине.
Because I need to say that Anthony himself was one of the first who was like a doctor, like a priest, and like a teacher for courses of palliative medicine.
И одна из его самых жизнеутверждающих книг называется «Жизнь, болезнь, смерть».
And one of his most life-affirming books is called Life, Illness and Death.
И я хотел буквально сказать, как это связано с темой Данте для меня.
And I would like to tell you very quickly how that's related to the topic of Dante for me.
Потому что у смерти есть еще один аспект, это смерть на войне.
And because death has yet another aspect, and that's death during war.
И я никогда бы не мог об этом говорить 4 года назад. Но у нас в Украине сейчас война происходит.
And I could never have talked about this 4 years ago, but you might know that there is war going on in Ukraine.
И ровно 4 года назад в моем городе мы каждый день боялись, что завтра войдут танки.
And exactly 4 years ago in my city, we were afraid actually every day that tomorrow the tanks might enter the city.
В таком состоянии мы провели несколько месяцев.
And we spent several months in that state of anxiety.
И это был совершенно уникальный и наивный опыт.
And it was a very unique and also naive kind of experience.
Мы несколько месяцев боялись.
We were simply afraid for several months.
В какой-то момент надоело бояться.
And at some point we were fed up with being afraid.
Да, и встал один единственный вопрос.
And one single question arose.
Как в такой ситуации страха мы можем начинать?
How can we begin in this situation of fear?
Мы не можем бесконечно изучать вариации зла.
We cannot spend all the time studying different variations of evil.
Открывается какая-то невероятная свобода постановки одного вопроса.
And what then opens up is an amazing freedom to pose one single question.
Это вопрос очень простой. Знаем ли мы в своем сердце что-то более глубокое, чем война?
The very simple question, actually, do we know something within our own hearts, in the depth of our own hearts, that is greater than war?
И мы должны эту глубину найти немедленно.
And we immediately need to find this depth within ourselves.
У нас нет времени.
Because we don't have time.
И тогда оказалось, что Данте — это не великий итальянский поэт, а специалист по аду.
And then it turned out to us that Dante is not actually a great Italian poet of the past, but he's a specialist in hell.
И в очень интересном аспекте.
In one very interesting aspect.
Потому что все советские люди из Данте знали только одну строчку.
Because all people with Soviet experience knew only one line out of Dante.
Оставь надежду всяк сюда входящий.
Leave hope behind, all you who enter here.
Но мы не знали, что это надпись на аде.
But we never knew that this was actually the title of hell.
Советские люди воспринимали это как урок трезвости.
Soviet people had understood this as a lesson in sobriety.
И вдруг 4 года назад мы поняли, что Данте для нас дорог другим.
And all of a sudden, 4 years ago, we understood that Dante is important to us for a different thing.
Это человек, который умеет выводить из ада.
He is the person who can lead us out of hell.
И мы в 2014 году первый раз в Харькове провели фестиваль Данте.
And so in 2014, we had the very first festival on Dante in Kharkov.
Это был прямо год войны.
That was the year of the very top height of the war.
И нам говорили, вы сумасшедшие. Есть масса важных дел.
And we were like crazy people. There are loads and loads of important things we should be doing.
Переселенцы, больницы, люди, у которых горе.
There are refugees, there are people in hospitals, loads of people with grief.
И тогда я открыл точку очень важную, которую я сегодня тоже слышу.
And that's when I opened up a moment that I heard again today.
Я увидел, что люди делятся не только по идеологии, образованию, национальности, но еще по одному очень важному признаку.
It's not just nationality or education or other things like that distinguish people from each other.
Есть люди, которые говорят в катастрофической ситуации: сегодня не до поэзии.
There are some people who say in a catastrophic situation, today is not the right day for poetry.
И есть другие люди, которые говорят, только поэзия нам поможет.
And other people say the only thing that will help us now is poetry.
Потому что мы должны найти эту точку человечности.
Because we need to find that point of humanity.
Которая глубже, чем катастрофа.
Which runs deeper than catastrophe.
И странным образом в моей жизни в последние годы эти три темы — митрополит Антоний, паллиативная медицина и Данте — всегда вместе.
And for this reason, for the last couple of years, these three things, palliative medicine, Dante, and Metropolitan Anthony, have always been together.
Thank you.
Very hard to follow that, I think. But as a great Russian friend of mine used to say, it is all arranged upstairs. It is all arranged upstairs. That is Nicholas Zernov's favorite remark. That phrase about becoming tired of being afraid, I think, resonates a great deal, because I have a feeling, Heather, that that's something to do with the world of palliative care as well. You can't spend all your time simply thinking about the loss, the weakness. Something else has to come in.
I think some of the most extraordinary people, some of the bravest people have been those that have faced it. I think that so much of our society encourages us to run away from death and dying and loss. In fact, I was speaking to a very eminent physician recently, and he was doing a piece of filming for me, and he began by saying, "If I die." And he had forgotten that it is a reality. It's a when I die. And he said it twice. And I think that the bravery that we hear today is about when people recognise when I die, and then they start to begin to work towards that in some way.
I think we can open this up now to questions from the audience and observations people want to share. You can address questions to any of the panel, or all of them, or just leave it to be picked up as you think fit. So are there any comments people would like to put in here? Right at the back.
Two point questions. One, I was surprised that the title is The Human Being, a Paradox of Freedom. And then George started speaking about Christian freedom. So I wonder if, because when you spoke about that freedom, I thought that's human, that's not Christian only. So why did you introduce it in that way? And then secondly, you spoke about catastrophe, war, death. And these are situations that makes us face with freedom. And so I thought, actually, it's paradox, as it says, because when we are denied freedom, apparently, that's the moments when we think about our freedom. And when we live freedom, then we don't acknowledge it. And then many times, then when we have to face it, then we don't know where to start from. So I wanted to understand your...
Thank you very much. George, you want to come back on that?
Thank you very much. That's a very good point. I think I started with the paradox of Christian freedom because I think there's a tendency, particularly in the Western world, in kind of liberal democracy, to counterpoise on the one side what Rowan Williams called consumer liberty, the freedom to do whatever I want, but then to characterize Christianity as obedience to God. And it was interesting, the phrase which Rowan came up with at the beginning of, to do what I have to do. And I think what I was trying to suggest in my reflections is that it might be nice to move beyond that binary, to think about Christianity not just being about obedience and doing what we have to do necessarily, but actually that the laws of Christianity free us, that they're like ligaments of a body, to then be truly free and open to freedom. And I just wonder whether I'm over, because I was so struck by what Aleksandr said about Dante, but I think it's also part of your second point. I know Heather's going to respond to that when we have that kind of experience of the war in Ukraine, or even of the deprivation and the lack of freedom in the former Soviet bloc, it's easy just to think of freedom as the freedom to do whatever I want, or the freedom we have in a liberal democracy. And I think just in my own experience, what made me turn to Dante as a British person who hadn't really come across Dante, not that I was restricted in freedom or under that kind of suffering, where I can see it's extremely potent, but actually a kind of fed upness with the kind of secular liberal freedom, the sense that it didn't have the depth, that it was superficial, that it wasn't confronting death, it wasn't confronting the mystery of love, it wasn't confronting our dialogue with or the relationship with history or with God. And so for me, what made me free, in a sense, was exploring Dante, who opened up that world. So it wasn't just opening up a hell and recognizing that, but it was opening up a whole world, purgatory, paradise as well, opening up paradise, which is really a celebration of the lives of the saints, a celebration of the kind of human freedom that can come through a kind of profound encounter with reality. And I couldn't find that in the sort of modern secular world which I was brought up in. Thank you.
Only briefly, but just to say something around the paradox that you describe. And Sometimes it's my greatest pleasure and sometimes it's my most profound sadness in my work that for some people the end of their life is the time when they start to connect with the happiness and the freedom that they could have enjoyed for much of their whole of their life. And I sometimes get letters from people who say, you know, surprisingly, the last 2 years of my life have been the happiest because I've reconciled some of my relationships. I've connected with people for whom I can make as a difference as much as I'm receiving something. I can be part of a community. And I'm grateful that we've been able to enable that. And I'm deeply sad that it's happening now and it didn't happen in the last 70 years of somebody's lives. So I don't have an answer for it. I'm just always... I just note it.
Спасибо за вопрос.
Thank you for the question.
Я опять вернусь к митрополиту Антонию.
I'll return to Metropolitan Anthony.
Его отцами были люди, которые прошли концлагеря.
His fathers, his elders were people who'd been through concentration camps.
И для него был очень важен этот урок свободы в лагерях.
And to him, that lesson of freedom in the camps was very important.
И он говорил, что действительно признание человеческой свободы, не христианской свободы, это точка, в которой мы все вместе, и атеисты, и христиане, и все.
And he said that actually that question of freedom, human freedom, not Christian freedom, is a moment where we're all together, Christians, atheists, no matter who we are.
Но христианская свобода начинается в тот момент, когда мы понимаем, что мы, как люди, свободу легко предаем.
But Christian freedom begins when we understand that we as people,
Что мы, люди, предаем свободу.
we find it very easy to betray freedom.
Мы соглашаемся на маленькое.
And we are happy to accept a little thing.
А Христос не согласен.
But Christ didn't agree with that.
То есть к каждому из нас он обращается только с одним вопросом.
So he has only one question for every one of us.
Ты можешь считать себя кем угодно.
No matter who you think you are.
Но я тебя называю другом.
But I, Christ, I'll call you friend.
И для моего отца ты сын.
And for my father, you are son.
И эта точка несогласия Христа на меньшее.
And that point where Christ won't accept something smaller than that.
И было вдохновением митрополита Антония.
That was what inspired Metropolitan Anthony.
Он считал, что христианство нужно для этого вдохновения.
He thought Christianity was necessary for that kind of inspiration.
Нужен Бог, не согласный на наше предательство.
We need God who won't agree to our betrayal.
I think there was another question towards the back. And could I just see if there are a couple more to come? One in the front, one there, one there.
So to Aleksandr, you said at one point that you were tired of being afraid. And I feel like being afraid is also a bit not being free. And I also feel that the world we live in is quite scary in a lot of ways. I mean, we're not actually living in a war here, but there are a lot of things that are scary. And I wanted to ask you, where do you find the courage to face your fears and to be free?
Не быстрые вопросы.
These aren't very fast questions.
Но если вы спросите лично меня,
If you mean me personally,
и чтобы не сокращать путь,
and so as not to shorten the way,
я понял для себя одну вещь, что, как ни странно, это только опыт реальной красоты.
That might sound strange, but I think it's only possible through the experience of real beauty.
Если у меня нету опыта встречи с реальной красотой, которая меня волнует.
If I don't have an experience of real beauty that touches me.
И мы сейчас не говорим о масштабе этой красоты.
We're not even talking about the scope of this beauty.
Это может быть глаза ребенка, травинка, снежинка.
Could be the eyes of a child. It could be grass. It could be a snowflake.
Это может быть божественная комедия.
It could be the divine comedy.
Но главное этот момент встречи, которая волнует твое сердце.
But nevertheless, that is a moment that touches my heart.
Если в ситуации опасности, я помню об этом.
And if I remember that in a moment of danger,
открывается этот путь, где мы можем с Христом смотреть друг на друга.
Then that road will open where Christ and I can look at each other.
Вот эта общая встреча, это точка встречи, это красота, которая волнует мое сердце.
And that the encounter is beauty that touches my heart.
Владыка Антоний потрясающе говорил одну вещь, что в сложных ситуациях чувство долга может не найти путь к решению проблемы.
And Metropolitan Anthony said something very important. He said, in a dangerous situation, the feeling of obligation might not actually reach my heart.
Очень часто нам недостаточно мужества.
Very often we are not courageous enough.
И этика нам отказывает.
And ethics won't help us.
Но спасает благодарность.
But what will save us is gratefulness.
Благодарность за встречу с реальной красотой.
Gratefulness that we had an encounter with real beauty.
И когда я вижу красивую снежинку, это рождает вопрос: кого мне благодарить?
And when I see a beautiful snowflake, it gives rise to the question, who do I have to thank for this?
И мне кажется сейчас, что это вообще единственный путь.
And now I actually have come to the conclusion that's the only way.
Thank you. I'd like to take the three questions I noted together, if that's all right, and ask all the panel for some quick responses so that we don't go on too long. Hope that's all right, but we had one here. I think there was one there and one over here. So let's just take those three together, please.
I start from what you just, the gratefulness, being grateful that you say, and from that image that we put there, because that one, the hand of the child holding on the finger, is the image of freedom, as we have been discussing. But with the hand, you can do one thing. It's not that you can hold the hand and hold something else. So it seems to me that this possibility to be free, as that child is just in realizing what reality is. Is that the trick? Reality, what is reality speaking of? What is reality? A friend of ours this summer was saying the grammar of reality. Understanding what reality at its depth is and what reality is asking of me to let what I have in my hand go and hold on. Is it so simple?
My question ties together what George was talking about with freedom. Christian freedom is more than just being able to choose whatever we want, though it's also deeper than just a kind of blind obedience. And then looking at what Heather said about palliative care, and I think we can all acknowledge the importance of those things, being able to say sorry, goodbye, thank you, and also ideally much earlier than the moment of death throughout our life. But I'm just sort of imagining an example of someone dying suddenly, perhaps young, in a car crash. Maybe they have been living a good life, maybe they haven't. But it seems that we can't necessarily say they aren't free in that moment of death, simply because the circumstances have meant they haven't had that space to talk, to say sorry, to say final goodbyes. It's almost like freedom must be more than that, especially at the end of life. So if I want something to do with that.
Hello. My question relates with I can't explain how I reach these things in my life because it's my experience, but more or less for me freedom is the conscience of being loved by God, every day, like being precious for Him. But in the meantime that I'm doing this work on this freedom every day with the help of the place I am, I struggle with sentence that Julian Caron told us that is freedom's like a fire. We tend to think it's like a pen, then we have it, and we have it forever, no? But instead, it's like a fire you have to grow, because it's a relationship. Okay with that, but I'm working on that, I mean. But in this summer, and this is a personal question, with my friends on the beach where I go in Spain, I have a friend that tends to be communist, like influenced by Nietzsche, Marx, and those kind of philosophers. And he told me that, okay, everything that you say, very good, okay, but there's many people that doesn't have anything to it. How could you say that's freedom? I mean, and that makes me wonder, for me, freedom is what I told, but what for people that don't even know God? They can't have the conscience of being loved, even if they are. So that's more or less my question.
Thank you. 3 very substantial questions which could keep us here until 6 p.m., I think. But I'm going to ask the 3 panelists for very brief comments on any or all of those questions. And I'll start with Heather.
Okay, thank you. Well, maybe I'll answer the easiest, which is your question about, so I've talked about a kind of death where people have time to prepare, and it's at the end of a long, good life, really, in many respects, and you're quite rightly challenging me on, well, what about the rest? My point would be that actually real freedom lies in us all living life as though today is our last. And that doesn't mean living in a sort of morbid anxiety. In fact, your question earlier about how do you free yourself from daily anxiety is something that I think about and contemplate a lot in my own personal life. So I think actually it's about being ready today. And the saddest moments that I have is where people find reconciliation, for example, in relationships, either with between themselves and other people, or between themselves and their God, and they've had to wait until they're 70 or 80 to do it. It's so sad they're not doing it when they're 26 or 27. And that lady who hadn't seen her brother for 16 years, both of them had been in a kind of living hell in that time. So I'm talking, I think actually we're saying the same thing.
Thank you.
Aleksandr. Герой современной культуры — это активист.
The hero of contemporary culture is the activist.
И это влияет на наши дискуссии о свободе.
And that has a great influence on our discussion on freedom.
Но есть 2 разных подхода к одиночеству.
But there are 2 different approaches to loneliness or...
Одно понимание — это когда я активист, но мне никто не помогает.
One is to think I am an activist, I am an active person, but nobody helps me.
И второе понимание одиночества для меня более важно.
And the second understanding of loneliness is more important for me.
Когда мне кажется, что меня никто больше не зовет по имени.
That is when I think nobody will actually call me by my name.
И тогда вопрос о свободе — это не вопрос того, какое действие я должен предпринять.
And in that case, the question about freedom is not what action do I need to take.
А вопрос о том, могу ли я свободным образом слышать всех, кто меня зовет и кто меня любит.
But can I actually hear everybody who calls me by my name and who loves me?
Я могу заранее отказаться от этой позиции.
I am free to renounce that position from the very start.
Но я могу и увидеть, насколько это богатая позиция.
But I can also see how rich that position is.
И для меня тема свободы связана с темой новой пассивности.
And for me, the question of freedom is linked to the question of a new kind of passivity.
Потому что пассивность — это не просто, когда я ничего не делаю.
Passivity is not just when I'm not doing anything.
Это очень особое отношение к реальности.
It's a very special relation to reality.
У митрополита Антония был потрясающий образ.
Metropolitan Anthony had a very good image for that.
Он говорил, мы не можем назвать собаку на охоте пассивной.
We cannot call a dog who's hunting passive.
Когда она видит дичь, она вся напряжена.
Whenever she sees the bird, the dog sees the bird, it's very much standing to attention.
Каждая мышца в напряжении, уши подняты.
Every muscle is tense, its ears are pricked.
И он добавлял, что в отличие от нас, христиан, собака еще успевает вилять хвостом.
And unlike us Christians, the dog even manages to wag its tail.
Чему мы должны у нее научиться?
And this is what we have to learn from the dog.
Потому что она более свободна, чем мы.
The dog is more free than we are.
В этой ситуации.
In that situation.
Для меня тема свободы — это еще и тема нищеты.
And for me, freedom is also linked to the topic of poverty.
Которая начинается тогда, когда мы понимаем, что не только люди умирают от голода.
When we understand that it's not only that somewhere people are dying from hunger.
Но мы умираем от голода.
But we also dying from hunger.
И мы нуждаемся.
And we also are in need.
В том, чтобы знать, что мы любимы.
Because we need to understand that we are loved.
И это привилегия свободного человека открыть эту любовь.
And it's the privilege of the free person to understand and open up that love for themselves.
И потом со всеми голодными в этом мире стать попрошайками.
And then we can become beggars together with all the other people in need of this world.
George.
So it's impossible to follow that, and it's just such. I just want to reaffirm, what a privilege it is to be here, to have this space to talk about human freedom, because I'm learning so much. One thing I just add in response to what Marco was saying, which I really agree with, this contact with reality, which I can speak to from my own experience. I do think, and it's also what Heather was saying, in our secular culture, we have this tendency to run away from reality. And that's particularly seen in this running away from death. But we might also think of it in terms of running away from commitment. If we exalt freedom, to be free from everything, there's all sorts of things we run away from. We might run away from difficult relationships, from saying sorry, from saying goodbye, because we're wanting to fulfill, to have our own desires at that moment. So I think one thing I'm learning this morning is that there's a mystery of freedom in terms of not running away. But I think it's a very interesting question which came up about when there are people who don't know God, and what about people who've got nothing to eat, where's their freedom? So how do we not run away today? I think one of the things we do running away is also in our minds. We have a celebrity culture. We have all these wonderful lives that people are living. It's so easy to run away with some great idea of what I'm going to be and not be in contact with the reality which is right before me. And I think faith does give a very special way of encountering that reality, because we believe that God gives us what we need now to do what we need to do to fulfill our freedom. So we don't need to be running away from what's in front of us, and we also don't want to need to be living in our heads, in our dreams. What God is doing with us, He's doing with precisely the difficulties, the sufferings, the anxieties, the tensions that we have now. So I think that's how we with faith can live our reality, be really in contact with reality, as Marco so beautifully expressed it. But then I think in terms of people who have no food, who have no shelter, I think that a saint like Teresa of Calcutta, Mother Teresa, was surely trying to bring to those people that sense that they are precious in God's eyes, and that again, in terms of dignity of dying, that they are loved, and you're trying to bring those people to the poorest of the poor.
Well, we have, I think, in that last round of question and answer, a very wide range, both of thoughts and of images, to take away. We've been reminded of the way in which the discipline of attending to reality is at the basis of all this. To be free at the cost of cutting ourselves off from what is real is an illusion. We can't be free by pretense, we can't be free by pretending we're immortal or without limits. Our freedom is to be here, in this moment, and to receive, to be grateful. As Aleksandr said, it's the freedom for the dog with its ears pricked and its tail wagging. Attention, desire, and at the same time, joy. And to get all of those together, that's when freedom happens, it seems to me. And sometimes we have one or two at best, but not all of them. And a Christian spirituality that is, I think, alive and well for a world like ours is one in which all those three elements are at work. They come into focus, as we've been reminded, in the face of crisis, in the face of suffering and of loss, which doesn't mean that suffering or loss or hunger or deprivation are good things in themselves. But those are the ways in which, again and again, we discover mysteriously the freedom to love and respect and believe in our humanity. The question of feeding the hungry, literally feeding the hungry, is after all not just about providing them with meals. It's about helping them understand that their humanity is precious. And that's part of this entire enterprise too. So I leave you with two more brief images and thoughts. One is, I can't remember who said this originally, and it's been said in various ways, but it's worth hearing again, connects with something George was saying. At the end of time, I won't be asked by God why I wasn't Mother Teresa of Calcutta. I will be asked why I wasn't Rowan Williams. That is, why I wasn't real in myself. The second is an image from, I think, originally a Hindu context. A man is running away from a tiger. He reaches a cliff edge and jumps off. He finds there's a ledge to hang on to, a bit of a bush hanging over. He clings to the bush, and as he clings there, he sees two small mice gnawing away at the roots of the bush so that it's gradually coming away from the cliff edge. As he hangs there, he sees a small flower in the cleft of the rock in front of him, and he says, "That's beautiful." The moment in which we're free enough to say that's beautiful, as we face our mortality, our risk, that's the moment of gratitude, that's the moment of liberty, that's the moment when we align ourselves with what God wants to give in freedom. I'm sure you want to join me in saying the warmest words of thanksgiving to all our three wonderful panelists this morning who have so illuminated, delighted, challenged, and enlarged our minds and hearts.
Well, I would second that thanks. It's been an unbelievably challenging, thought-provoking and moving morning. Thank you all, and thank you also to Josephine for translating so beautifully. Just a very few words. The first thing is to say that we have a break for lunch. Lunch is available, if you would like, for purchase outside the room. We would encourage you to take advantage of the exhibitions that are here. And there are guided tours available if you would like to take advantage of guided tours. We will return to this room at 3 o'clock for the afternoon meeting on the question of, is it possible to be free at work? There'll be a further gap in which you can also look at tours after that meeting. And then at 6:30 in the afternoon or early evening, there'll be an original play, which will be a new dramatization of the Grand Inquisitor, which, as perhaps most of you know, is contained within the Brothers Karamazov. So that's the rest of the programme. But before we break, I would just like briefly to invite Deacon Peter Scorer to come to the stage. Deacon Peter is the chairman of the Anthony of Suru's Foundation, and I think he would like to say just a couple of words.
Thank you very much. Some of the things we've heard this morning, quite extraordinary. I'm reminded very much that I've known Bishop Anthony more or less since my birth. Bishop Anthony came to England in 1949, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, the very first death that he attended was that of my grandfather in our family home in North London. I also was privileged to escort him to his grave when he died, and between those two dates I have always been extremely close and I could say a sort of devoted disciple of his. After his death, a small group of loyal followers in 2000, and he died in 2003, it was the following year that we came together in order to gather as much as we could of his archive. Bishop Anthony was a unique person, and his archive is unique. He hardly ever wrote anything. He spoke, and therefore his archive consists mostly of transcripts of thousands of audio cassettes and video recordings. It is the privilege and the duty of this foundation, called the Metropolitan Anthony of Suros Foundation, to collect together, publish, and preserve both his memory but also the physical memory in terms of the actual archive itself. And we have, over the last years, been able to digitize a large amount of the material. The job is not complete. We are in the process now of seeking a place where we can actually house this archive. We've had difficulty in doing that. A lot of libraries are too full. We publish some books and will be making available a digital record of as much of the material as we possibly can through the internet. You will find some leaflets describing our work and who we are, and if anybody wants to assist in any way, there are some requests for help contained in this leaflet, whether financial or in physical terms, in general support. And there are a very small number of his books. We weren't quite prepared, didn't know how many people would be here and how many people might be interested. But at the doorway to the exhibition, there are a couple of books of Metropolitan Anthony, some leaflets to take away. Thank you very much.